Um, I want to first thank Miranda for inviting me here and Ina for all her help with the arrangements. I'd also like to thank the Center for Chinese Studies for making this event possible, and all of you for coming to today. The presentation I'm going to give is really a work in progress, so if you have any feedback or suggestions, I definitely want to hear it. This is still sort of experimental. Okay. So, around 100 BC, the historian Sima Qian wrote the first extant biography of Confucius. It was part of his monumental effort to record all known history up to that point. One of his many sources was an earlier version of the text now known as Lunyu, or Analects in English, so the Confucian Analects. Today, Lunyu is considered to be the major source for Confucius's thought, the standard against which all other sources of it are judged. Yet most early China specialists agree that the Lunyu acquired this canonical status only in the early Eastern Han, so several generations after Sima Qian. Sima Qian's history then was written at a really interesting moment in the Lunyu's textual history. So in this talk, I'm going to do really three things. First, I want to carefully consider, it's forward, that's back, sorry. First, I want to carefully consider the nature of Sima Qian's Lunyu. So most work on Confucius in the Shiji assumes that Sima Qian had the entire text of the Lunyu, the same one that we have today. But recent scholarship, and in particular the trend known as Lunyu revisionism, calls this assumption into question. The Shiji is the first text to quote extensively from the Lunyu. If we let go of the assumption that Sima Qian's Lunyu source was identical to the one we have today, then the Shiji can actually possibly provide some interesting evidence about what an earlier version of that Lunyu text might have looked like. Now, the second thing I'm going to do is consider how Sima Qian uses his Lunyu material and how he seems to view this material as a source. There's some evidence that in Sima Qian's eyes, the Lunyu was neither canonical nor especially well known, so it doesn't seem like it was widely circulated. He relies heavily on it in his chapter for Confucius's disciples, but it's kind of only of secondary importance as a source in the chapter on Confucius himself. Furthermore, Sima Qian seems anxious to preserve the Lunyu's contents by including them in his work as much as possible. So this isn't an attitude he takes toward other texts that he says were widely circulated in his time. So again, implying that the Lunyu wasn't necessarily widely known. So finally, I'll consider an aspect of Sima Qian's Confucius that is less often studied. That is, Confucius as he appears outside his own biography in the Shiji. The Confucius chapter of the Shiji is often read as giving a very human portrait of Confucius the man. So both the recent Confucius movie in China and Michael Nyland's chapter in Lives of Confucius kind of use that chapter for this purpose. But elsewhere in the Shiji, Sima Qian uses sayings of Confucius and other sources to develop a kind of different portrait of him, and for other uses than just to show what he was like as a person. In doing this, he does use the Lunyu, but sometimes interprets it in unusual ways. So I'll talk a little bit about that if I have time. All right. So I'm going to start with just a little introduction to Lunyu revisionism. So the scholarly trend I refer to as Lunyu revisionism argues that the Lunyu was compiled much later than traditionally believed, that it was actually compiled sometime in the Western Han. And, I'm a little bit agnostic about this argument, but I think it's important to take it into account and to think about it. So to explain this argument, it's first necessary to give a little background on the Lunyu, on the Analects. It's usually believed to be sayings of and about Confucius, but almost no one believes that he actually wrote them down. So it's not by Confucius. It was thought to have been transmitted by immediate and less immediate disciples, somewhat like Gospels in the Christian tradition. So here's the story found in Bangu's History of the Han. This is an early Eastern Han story. This is traditionally accepted as the story of how the Lunyu was created. So the Lunyu talks about what it is, discussions with disciples and things he said. And then at the time that the master was alive, the disciples each had what they had written down. So they were all taking class notes. When the master died, the second generation disciples compiled these together, selecting them and editing them, and thus called them selected sayings. So that's the Eastern Han story. Now, if we look at it in one way, this picture seems so clear. I mean, it's perfectly plausible that this is where such a text would come from. It's passed down by generations of reverent disciples. But if we change the focus and look instead at the figure of Confucius within the textual world of the warring states, the period before the Han, everything becomes much murkier. So, forget that story of Bangu. Just look at sort of what we get in warring states texts. It seems like Confucius was like a sort of a stock character in warring states anecdotes. So sometimes he's a figure of wisdom, and sometimes he gets made fun of. Sometimes he's brought into dialogue with other figures, both disciples and opponents, in order to highlight strengths and weaknesses of the ideas associated with him. And in some texts, he's made to say things that the historical Confucius would clearly never have said. And I'm thinking here of the Zhuangzi in particular. This is all to say that Confucius was common property in the warring states. He didn't just belong to the Confucians. Everyone talked about him. Now, if a conservative Confucian were standing here beside me, he might say, oh, yes. But there was an authoritative set of core teachings of Confucius. The core of this core is today thought to be the Lunyu, with a few texts from the Classic of Rites also claiming some secondary place. But the Lunyu is just a fraction of all the surviving Confucius material. There's a lot of Confucius sayings. And more of this stuff is surfacing all the time with excavated texts. So this is kind of makes us realize what is at stake in the issue of Lunyu revisionism. It's not just a matter of pushing the date of the Lunyu forward a few centuries, sort of arguing that, it's a little later. But it's really an issue of calling into question the very central core of the Confucian belief system. If Lunyu was not compiled by Confucius's immediate disciples, then there's room for doubt that it is a reliable guide to the true teachings of the sage. I mean, that's how we take it today, but what if that were called into question? So without that as a standard, how could we judge what is a reliable guide? If that's not it, what is? So Lunyu revisionists have a great deal of extremely suggestive evidence, but no solid proof. Some of the evidence, just quickly to go through, and there's stuff published on this, but the Lunyu was not known by the name Lunyu before the Western Han. There are surprisingly few parallels or citations of Lunyu in Warring States texts, and there's also no indication that Lunyu parallels have any special status compared to other sayings attributed to Confucius that aren't in Lunyu. So they're kind of, when there are Lunyu parallels, they're just used the same way as non-Lunyu sayings. Not all Lunyu parallels are even attributed to Confucius. Sometimes they're unattributed. Sometimes they're attributed to other people. And finally, there's very little sense that any set of Confucian sayings existed as a fixed grouping. Now, the stories we do have of Lunyu's creation in Lunhang and the history of the Han, as I mentioned, they both date from the Eastern Han. That's really pretty late. So there's no other stories about the Lunyu's creation before that. And roughly at that time or a little before, we see an absolute explosion of explicit citations and detailed discussions of the Lunyu text, and mentioned by name. Suddenly the Lunyu was everywhere, just at this time. So this pattern of evidence has led to different versions of the revisionist hypothesis, advanced by scholars such as John Makem, Mark Csikszentmihalyi, and most recently my Princeton classmate Mick Hunter. They believe that the Lunyu as a text was to some degree a creation of the Western Han, whatever that means. Sometimes the definition gets a little vague. So I presented a draft of this paper at a conference organized to debate that issue. And one of the papers that was pre-circulated by the organizers was an article by Kaneto Mamoru arguing that the Shiji was a source for the Lunyu rather than the other way around. So Shiji came first. I don't accept that hypothesis, at least in its most radical form. I argue that Sima Qian had a Lunyu. May seem trivial, but it's an argument we're saying. This is what I think. He mentions it by name as a source, for one thing, in a passage I'll show in a moment, and that has claimed to being one of the earliest mentions of the Lunyu text. Kaneto has to fall back on insisting that this is a later interpolation. Oh, somebody else stuck that name in. I don't think so. Furthermore, Shiji parallels provide witness for about a quarter of the full received Lunyu text. So some percentages are as high as 60% for some chapters. So this is kind of complicated looking, but this is a chart of the entire Lunyu. The chapters go across, the items within the chapter go down. And the shaded things are passages that the Shiji quotes in some way. So, you see it's a pretty good amount of it. We also see that some chapters are especially well attested. So some of these individual chapters, 50%, 40%, 50, almost 60% in some cases, those particular 4 chapters are really well attested. And then other chapters are not attested at all. So chapter 16, so 20 and 16, nothing. And some of these other ones, only like 1 or 2 sayings from the chapter are in there. So, it's sort of an interesting distribution there. Now, parallels in themselves can't reliably indicate the direction of borrowing, right? We don't know which one came first just from looking at this. However, Sima Qian, for all his virtues, was not a great innovator of Confucian thought. He was a historian, and his genius lay in selecting from and organizing his source documents so that they tell an engaging narrative. We see this clearly for Shiji chapters where the direction of borrowing is far more secure. He just takes stuff, puts it in his history, and edits a little bit, makes it sound nice. He's not writing this stuff. So I can say with a pretty high degree of confidence that Sima Qian did not compose all these 130 odd Lunyu passages that are attested in the Shiji. Consider, furthermore, if we dug up some bundle of bamboo strips that contained all the sayings found in this chart, most scholars would have no problem calling this a Lunyu, even if it lacked that title. Of course, it's an open question whether it was one bundle or several bundles, but at least we'd be comfortable saying that's a Lunyu. That said, the pattern of Sima Qian's Lunyu citations might tell us a few things about what his Lunyu looked like. And this next part is a little speculative, but we could look for a minute at the holes in Sima Qian's Lunyu. So the big white passages, right, where he's left out stuff, or where it seems like stuff is missing from his Lunyu. Let's put it that way. Now, one of Kaneto's interesting observations is that Lunyu material associated with the disciple Zhengzi, so one of Confucius's famous disciples, is totally absent from the Shiji. Zhengzi is the disciple of Confucius who's most closely associated with the virtue of xiao, or filial piety. And perhaps not by accident, Lunyu discussions of filial piety are also absent from the Shiji. So here's the red passages are ones that are mention Zhengzi. The pink ones are ones that mention filial piety or duty to parents. So not necessarily just the word, but the idea too. And almost none of them are used. There's only one of them that's actually appears in the Shiji, and that's a very offhand little reference, just saying someone was filial. And so that fills up some of the holes. If you see what are some of the missing parts from Sima Qian's Lunyu, that's one of them. All right. So I've looked into whether were they not just part of Sima Qian's Lunyu, or did he just deliberately exclude them? That's hard to say, and I looked into it a little bit, but it's kind of complicated. In looking at patterns of omission, perhaps a clearer case is Lunyu items which consist of only the disciple's own pronouncements. So the master doesn't say anything, it's just the disciple saying something. And some of the big holes in Shiji's Lunyu are these types of items, most notably in chapters 1, 8, and 19. So if these items were part of Sima Qian's Lunyu at all, he at least didn't consider them worth preserving. And you can see, especially 19, right? It's really filled up. The colored ones are not in Sima Qian's Lunyu. So in talking about this, I've rejected the more radical claims of Lunyu revisionism by making an argument that Sima Qian did have a Lunyu. On the other hand, I'm happy to entertain the revisionist hypothesis to the extent of conceding that Sima Qian's Lunyu may have looked very different from the one that we have today. It might have been much shorter, for example. Just because one passage from a chapter seems to have been part of Sima Qian's Lunyu doesn't mean that the entire chapter was. His Lunyu could easily have been organized differently, especially at the beginning and the end. And so in the remainder of my presentation, I'll continue to kind of entertain the question of what Sima Qian's Lunyu might have looked like. But now I'm going to also turn to look at how Sima Qian uses Lunyu as a source. So overall, the Shiji uses Lunyu in 3 distinct ways. First, we see it in places where the historian reflects on his own work, those so-called Taishigong passages. Sima Qian very often, there's sort of comments at the end of chapters, sometimes at the beginning. Sima Qian often embroidered these comments with a quotation, and many, but certainly not all of the quotations, are from Lunyu. The second way that Sima Qian uses Lunyu is to build up a portrait of Confucius in the chapter devoted to him. So there are Lunyu quotations. There, the Lunyu quotations are mixed liberally with other sources. Many, many sources, Lunyu quotations kind of a small percentage. And I'll discuss that in a moment. The Lunyu quotations there show some intriguing variants, too. And then finally, the Shiji uses the Lunyu as in a separate chapter that is devoted to Confucius's disciples. And this chapter is kind of relatively less studied. So I'm going to start with the last one, the chapter on the Confucian disciples. Lunyu plays a surprisingly big role here. And it's also the chapter in which Sima Qian actually mentions the Lunyu by name. So here we have the historian's comment. This is the last comment, found at the end of the disciples chapter. I've left out any modern punctuation because every edition I consulted, or every translation, had a different punctuation. So I'm like, okay, punctuation is interpretation. So I left it out, just kind of number these passages to start with. So it is a very awkward and difficult passage, but I believe it's possible to make sense of it. I don't think we have to resort to the theory that it's some clumsy interpolation. There just are awkward passages in classical Chinese sometimes. But the beginning's not too hard. The beginnings is, many scholars talk about the 70 disciples of the master. In praising them, some exaggerate the reality. In defaming them, some diminish the truth. The little parallelism there in 2. So it's in Numbers 3 through 6 that the trouble really starts. All right, so this is my guess. If one wants a balanced appraisal without being able to personally see the disciples' faces or demeanor, then one could discuss the register of disciples and what comes out of the Kong family ancient script texts, and thereby come near to correctness. And he goes on to say, I've used this list of names, surnames, and literary names of the disciples and entirely employed the questions asked by disciples in the Lunyu. I combined and arranged these materials to make a chapter. What was doubtful, I left blank. I should emphasize that the parsing of this is pretty highly controversial, but I take there to be 2 texts. A register of disciples, which lists the names and such, and then the Lunyu, which is here also referred to as the Kong family ancient script. So he refers to the same text 2 ways. I think this is the best way to understand it. My choice is guided by the structure of the chapter itself. So if you read the rest of the chapter, it takes as its base the list of disciples. And then after each of them sort of optionally includes some extra information about them as a kind of commentary. And this information is mostly drawn from the Lunyu. One difficult issue here, though, is how to take this shi, which I've translated as entirely. Commentators tend to understand it in 2 different ways. Either as saying that all the material in the disciples chapter came from Lunyu, or that all the material in the Lunyu is included in this chapter. Neither of these are true. It both falls here. So at least as far as the received Lunyu is concerned. Of course, Sima Qian doesn't just say Lunyu. He says Lunyu Di Zi Wen, which is the questions asked by disciples in Lunyu. That doesn't help much, though, because there are many questions asked by disciples in today's Lunyu that Sima Qian doesn't use here. Interestingly, though, if we take a look at Sima Qian's Lunyu, that is that 25% or so that is attested in the Shiji, the statement is strikingly accurate. So here's the red. The red represents. Let's get rid of that. The red represents what's used in the disciple chapter. And the blue represents just a few passages that are disciple questions that aren't used in the disciple chapter. They appear elsewhere. But that's actually a fairly small number of exceptions here. And most of them, the disciple asks something and Confucius talks about himself. So it wouldn't be clear what disciple to put it under. It appears in the Confucius chapter. This is a large enough number to look pretty statistically significant. Aside from these blue passages, there are no other disciple dialogues that don't appear in this chapter. That's in Sima Qian's version of the Lunyu, that 25%. So I wouldn't want to place too much weight on this argument. It's interesting, but it just relies on one word in one passage. It does maybe deserve to be considered as evidence that Sima Qian's Lunyu was indeed much smaller than the received Lunyu. At least it's one piece of evidence. It might even be worth considering whether some passages found in the Disciples chapter but not in today's Lunyu might have originally been part of Sima Qian's Lunyu. But again, pretty speculative. Turning to the distribution of Lunyu passages used in the Disciples chapter, this is also kind of an interesting pattern. You see that the majority of the parallels here are clustered into 4 chapters, chapters 5, 6, 11, and 12. Again, this seems potentially significant. It doesn't prove anything, but it might provide at least some hint about the structure of Sima Qian's source. Maybe his source, had these chapters or something. As we might expect from the comment at the end of the Disciples chapter, the Shiji itself shows some signs of disciple factionalism. Remember, the comment said some people overpraise them, some people, criticize them too much. And if this disciple factionalism was going on in the Han, Shiji does reveal it somewhat. Now, Mark Csikszentmihalyi has suggested that there was kind of a disciple vogue in the Han Dynasty, a sort of fascination with disciples as a set, sort of arguing for your favorite one, that kind of thing. And Sima Qian himself, he clearly favors some and doesn't favor others. For example, he portrays the virtuous Zisi as being vastly overrated, and the wealthy Zigong as being the true hero of Confucian tradition. He really likes Zigong. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the details. There are a lot of very interesting details, but I don't think Sima Qian's differential treatment of the 2 disciples is just a shallow admiration for wealth and power. It's often been read this way, but I don't think so. I think his portraits of these disciples bring out tensions that are implicit but maybe less clear in Lunyu, such as, did virtue and failure necessarily and tragically go together? Did you have to fail to be virtuous? Or could you be a good follower of Confucius and also prosper, like Zigong? So perhaps for Sima Qian, these 2 disciples represented a split in what it meant to be a follower of Confucius. If so, he seems to betray a certain bias towards Zigong, unless we want to read the Zigong materials as satirical, and that gets really complicated. On the other hand, maybe he was just trying for a more balanced appraisal. So at this point, I should probably move on to the Shiji chapter on Confucius himself. And I'm not going to give a full analysis of this chapter. It's already been studied quite a bit. Instead, I'm going to focus on its relationship with Lunyu, mentioning just a few of the more interesting features. But as before, I'll begin at the end and talk a little bit about the comment at the end of the chapter. Sima Qian doesn't mention Lunyu in his final comment here. Instead, he mentions reading Confucius's own writings, by which he means commentaries on the classics. He also describes a trip he made to visit the Kong family ancestral home. It's interesting that what he emphasizes about this is the living ritual performance that was being done there, not textual records. But did he obtain any special Confucius lore while he was on his trip there, and did he give it any credence? I've often thought that if the Lunyu really was the historically important text that everyone traditionally believed it was, it seemed like Sima Qian would have had a good look at it during his trip. But he doesn't say anything about it either way, unfortunately. Sources for the Confucius chapter do appear to be much more heterogeneous than for the Disciples chapter. And as so often in Shiji, we see Sima Qian's much criticized tendency to be inclusive rather than selective. He grabs everything he can, sticks it in, rather than being particularly careful. So we get anecdotes from the Guoyu, where Confucius displays arcane knowledge of really weird phenomena, and they get as much play as the inspiring ethical pronouncements for which the Lunyu Confucius is known. Most of all, though, the star of the Confucius chapter is an active participant in the events of his time. And he's a successful custodian of the textual tradition. So that's pretty much where the focus is in that chapter. Now, if we look kind of quickly at the chapter's use of Lunyu parallels, we see some interesting tendencies. First, the Shiji passages with Lunyu parallels tend to get assigned a date and a historical context. This aspect of Confucius' chapter is traditionally explained by saying that Sima Qian had the Lunyu sayings and he just kind of made guesses about where to put them. That's sort of pretty plausible. But the revisionist hypothesis would suggest that both Sima Qian and Lunyu compilers had a common third source, which contained those quotations, maybe embedded in stories or something, and maybe Sima Qian reworked the stories while Lunyu compilers stripped out the quotations, something like that. But the evidence either way is somewhat indirect, but my reading of the Shiji use of Lunyu in this chapter does yield a few curious things. For one thing, Sima Qian's Lunyu appears to have been an independent text. It doesn't seem like it was just scattered parallels that he drew from other places. What makes me think this? Well, it happens that one of the few Lunyu items that is paralleled in the Mencius, again, Mencius doesn't have very much Lunyu material at all, but there's a few of them, and one is this quotation, also found in Lunyu 522. So Confucius was in Qian, he said, "Perhaps we should go home. The gentlemen of my faction are wild and rustic, but in being promoted they will not forget their origins." And here's the Lunyu version, pretty similar. The end is a little different. So their accomplishments are becoming known, but they don't know how to be restrained. So these are two separate passages, one in Mencius, one in Lunyu. Now, Sima Qian has Confucius say the Mencius version, of close parallel to it, just before leaving Qian. And from Qian, Confucius goes on to Wei for a short time, and then he goes back to Qian. And there he says the same thing again, but this time in the Lunyu version. So this is two different incidents, same passage. This is pretty sloppy compiling. As the Shiji commentator Sima Zhen points out, these are really two versions of the same saying, right? These are not different sayings. But it does tell us something really valuable, and that is that Sima Qian had two different sources for this saying, sources which he understood to be quite distinct. Now, another curious item hints at that at least part of Sima Qian's Lunyu may have looked similar to the received version, the one we have today, and that it was decontextualized like the Lunyu, right? Lunyu is just lists of Confucian sayings, and that it was similarly organized or disorganized. Now, how do I know this? Well, one of the major events in the life of Confucius is always understood to be the time when he and his disciples were starving between Qian and Cai. They were stuck between Qian and Cai. They were all starving. And there are a lot of accounts of this event in different Warring States texts, just many, many accounts. Like I said, Confucius was common property. The accounts are used for widely varying purposes, sometimes to praise him, sometimes to criticize him. In the Shiji, this story includes a passage that's a very close parallel with Lunyu 15.2. And Lunyu 15.2 is explicitly set during the Qian Cai incident. Zilu says, does a princely man, does the Junzi get into this kinds of problems? And Confucius says, the princely man holds firm when in dire straits. The petty man in dire straits is the one who loses control like that, like you are. Now, in the Lunyu, the next passage, 15.3, there's nothing to indicate that it has anything to do with the previous passage. It's a different thing. Confucius said, "So do you take me for one who has studied much and understood it?" Zigong said, "Yes." "Is it not so?" Confucius said, "It is not so. I use one thread to string it all together." Now, this is usually related to the other Lunyu passage where Confucius mentions the one thread. But in the Shiji Confucius chapter, Sima Qian quotes the first one. Again, they're in Qian and Cai. Then he adds a line of narrative to connect the two. So he says Zigong looked upset. He's like listening to Confucius scolding Zilu, and Zigong gets upset too. And then we get the Lunyu 15.3 passage. So we get these passages that are sequential, kind of strongly implying that this dialogue with Zigong also takes place during the Qian Cai incident. This, again, seems like kind of clumsy compilation. The Lunyu 15.3 saying doesn't add much to the Qian Cai narrative, and it doesn't have much to do with the issues at hand there. It's never... In other accounts of the Qian Cai narrative, nothing like this occurs, whereas there are parallels to Zilu's complaint and such. So it does suggest that in Sima Qian's Lunyu, 15.2 and 15.3 were sequential as they are today, and Sima Qian sort of mistakenly took them as being chronologically related. And there are other passages like this. I just wanted to give you an example. Here's the third thing. So Shiji often adds to the Lunyu parallels by supplying them with a context, like I just showed. But there's also an opposite tendency that can be detected in Shiji's use of the Lunyu. The Shiji Lunyu parallels are often shorter than their counterparts in the received Lunyu. So this is especially apparent in a sequence of meetings between Confucius and mysterious men who criticize him. If the Confucius material is seen as falling along a spectrum of historical plausibility, these meetings are pretty much on the dubious end. They're really literary, they're really convenient as a vehicle for philosophical debate, and so they don't feel especially historical. But, that said, we get this parallel. A stranger comes by and hears Confucius playing the stone chimes. Here's Lunyu 1439. He criticizes Confucius for stubbornly trying to do the impossible and change the world when it's clearly hopeless. But this is sort of, in the Lunyu version, Confucius gets to rebut this criticism. He has a snappy response. It's a little difficult to translate, so my translation, again, is a little speculative, but it's clear, narratively, it's clear that it's intended to be a snappy response. Now, in the Shiji, he gets no rejoinder. But on the other hand, the stranger's remark is also a little bit less critical. So it seems like as if each text chooses a different way to make Confucius look better. The different editing, sort of different strands. In another anecdote, which is way too long to put up here, but appears in Lunyu 18:7, a hermit speaks to Zilu, implicitly criticizing Confucius's teachings. And in the Lunyu version, it's more elaborate and ends with a long comment by Zilu, a long speech on why Confucius is right and the hermit is wrong. In the Shiji version, there's no Zilu speech. They just go to look for the hermit and he disappeared. So these are two of many such examples. This pattern of variance suggests that the Shiji and the present Lunyu versions of these passages may perhaps derive from a third source text. It's hard to tell. But at least it seems like the present Lunyu, the received Lunyu that we have today, has been edited or added to by some Confucian apologist, and by someone who wants to make Confucius look better. And Sima Qian's version has not, or it's been edited differently. Anecdotes that bear traces of anti-Confucian attitudes like this might be a special case. Perhaps they weren't part of the text I'm calling Sima Qian's Lunyu. Perhaps they represented a separate bundle of bamboo strips or something. On present evidence, it's impossible to say, but this kind of uncertainty is worth noting. It's sort of an interesting feature. Now, the last feature of the Confucius chapter I just want to quickly mention is some strikingly messy passages near the end. As I said a moment ago, the Shiji tends to be really inclusive. So there are some remarks, I won't really go through it. The remarks in the Shiji itself support the idea that Sima Qian was deliberately trying to save everything he could. Given the scope of his project, though, there were maybe inevitably some sections that he couldn't get around to integrating particularly well. And there were places where, or maybe there were places where he just didn't know how to do it. So near the end of the Confucius chapter, after having discussed Confucius's work on each of the 6 classics, the Shiji narrative devolves into a series of just miscellaneous sayings. And I won't translate them, there's just too many of them, but they all have Lunyu parallels, every single one. So in this chart you see on the right, those are all the Lunyu parallels. Just this whole list of Lunyu parallel sayings. So it's sort of throughout the rest of the chapter, Lunyu sayings have been mixed with many other different kinds of source material, but here the scope narrows to just Lunyu. So this is like the leftover stuff at the end. Parallels are often abbreviated, variant, or switched around, and they're almost all drawn from chapters 7, 9, and 10. So here's the parts of the Lunyu that are quoted in the Confucius chapter, and then here's this messy passage. This is just the messy passage. You see like a kind of striking clustering. There's just the quoted from 7, 9, and 10. Again, I don't think it's reasonable to say that this section is an interpolation. Some people would say that just because it's kind of crummy, and Sima Qian was a great writer, right? But even great writers can have off days. And so I don't think this was an interpolation. The other thing that's sort of briefly mentioned about this passage is it's not quite as messy as it seems. It's actually a little bit organized. It's organized numerically. So it starts with 3 types of 4. Confucius had 4 teachings. He refused 4 things. And then it goes on to 3s. He was cautious about these 3 things. He seldom spoke about those 3 things. And it kind of goes down to 2s. And it's numerically organized, and then it kind of devolves into something else. But it's worth mentioning, especially since there's another whole chapter of Lunyu that is organized this way. by numbers, the sort of numerical. And that chapter is chapter 16. This is one of the chapters that is not at all attested in Sima Qian's Lunyu. So this seems really curious, because it seems like if Sima Qian had that chapter, he would have, shuffled it into his numbers passage, right? He had a perfect place to put it. So it kind of implies that Sima Qian just didn't have that chapter. And again, passages like this one kind of support my middle-of-the-road conclusions about Sima Qian's Lunyu. First, that he had a Lunyu. This shoddy passage seems like bits of it that he couldn't fit anywhere else, but he wanted to preserve. But also that some of the structure of the received Lunyu seems to be visible in the Shiji chapter. On the other hand, his Lunyu maybe didn't look quite like our Lunyu today. A final point on this issue. Sima Qian talks about at least some of the texts in a way that makes it clear they're widely known in his day. So describing some other texts. So describing, for example, the Guanzi and the Yanzi Chunqiu, he says, when it comes to their writings, many of our generation possess them, so I do not discuss them, but discuss instead their most outstanding endeavors. We get no such statement about his Lunyu. We could even read the Disciples chapter evaluation as saying that scholars of Sima Qian's day lacked the moderating influence of the Lunyu, so they tended to, make these wrong evaluations of disciples. Finally, in the Confucius chapter, some of this sloppy editing may result from the fact that Sima Qian was trying to preserve a messy text that he found potentially in danger of being discarded. I mean, he was wrong about this, right? But he didn't know. All right, so that's kind of what I have to say about the Confucius chapter. And I'm sort of nearly going to run out of time. I'm running about 5 minutes or something, right? But I'll talk a little bit about Confucius's roles within the Shiji generally. Sima Qian's Confucius, he appears just everywhere in the Shiji. And that's kind of ignored in studies of this, right? In addition to the Disciples chapter and the Confucius chapter, where he appears quite a bit, he also appears in 50 other chapters of this work. So that's quite a lot. One of the interesting general features of this is that when he appears in other chapters, he only appears in what we call authored material, not in compiled material, which is to say, Sima Qian himself quotes Lunyu, but his sources don't. And this is an argument that Lunyu revisionists have used because, to say, if the Lunyu were important in the Warring States, the sources that he was using, or the Qian sources he was using, would have also quoted it, but we don't see that. So as I mentioned before, Sima Qian's Confucius is first and foremost editor of the classics. His association with different classics kind of leads to different roles to him playing different roles in the Shiji. And I'm going to kind of focus on two very, very quickly. One is the Spring and Autumn Confucius. So this is Confucius, the historian, essentially. And the other is the esoteric Confucius, the Confucius who knew secret transmissions, secret things that he didn't really talk about. And both of these are fairly well drawn in the rest of the Confucius, in the rest of the Shiji. So for the Spring and Autumn Confucius, it kind of focuses on Confucius in his time, as a historical figure and as a commentator. And Sima Qian tried to make this Confucius a little more successful than he was in Lunyu, and Lunyu comes off as a bit of a loser. Confucius's portrait, he kind of emphasizes successes that Confucius had through in the historical tradition that don't appear in Lunyu. On the other hand, he was kind of constrained by his source material, so we do get this comment kind of frustrated on Sima Qian's part, saying that Confucius, as well as Boyi and Mencius, just had no thought of merely pandering to the customs of their time just to get by. But if you grasp a square tenon and wanted to insert it into a round hole, can it go in? Confucius is a square peg in a round hole, right? He's just too stubborn. This is Sima Qian's editorializing, comparing him to Zhou Yan, who was extremely successful, apparently. So again, this is that tension. Can you be a Confucian and not be a failure? Sima Qian attempts to resolve this tension in talking about the historical Confucius by showing how Confucius won out in the end posthumously. So one of the many ways Sima Qian tries to show this is by elevating Confucius's life story within the very structure of the Shiji. And many of those 50 chapters I mentioned, really just a few lines. Wherever a chapter sort of recounts the time that Confucius lived, Sima Qian will just insert an event from Confucius's biography, just to say Confucius was important. Confucius is like a milestone that you judge all the other events against. So that's kind of one way in which he elevates the importance of Confucius. Also, you get, kind of interestingly, and here's where Lunyu gets back into the picture, you get Confucius as a historical commentator, so he comments on historical events, and that's material comes from the spring and autumn tradition, like the Chunqiu, the Zuozhuan. But then you also get, Confucius as a judge of character. And that Confucius is a Lunyu Confucius. So, but it's kind of in the same model as the historical commentary. So you get this in one of the Shiji chapters. It says, Sima Qian says, Confucius had a saying that the princely man wishes to be slow in his speech and earnest in his conduct. Could not this refer to Wan Shi, Jianling, and Zhang Shu? These are the people who are the subject of this particular biography. This is a Lunyu quotation, and is using Confucius to talk about figures who lived later. And it kind of makes sense to see this as an extension of Confucius's role as a historical commentator. Note, however, that in the Lunyu, Confucius criticizes making these kinds of character judgments. So here's Lunyu 1429, not attested in the Shiji. Zigong was comparing people. The master said, are you some kind of worthy or something? As for me, I have no time for things like that. Note, this isn't in Shiji because Shiji is pretty sympathetic to Zigong and maybe also sympathetic to this idea of comparing people, right? Moving on quickly to the sort of esoteric Confucius, and I'm really going to run out of time here, but another aspect of Confucius that's reflected in both Shiji and Lunyu is his circumspection. There's all this stuff he doesn't talk about, supposedly. And these passages are shared in both texts, and this one in particular, Sima Qian quotes that 4 times in various ways. So basically, in the 2 texts, it's given different significance, though, and I won't really go into this. But just to say that in the Lunyu, it's taken to be that Confucius is just cautious of making pronouncements about things. These aren't things you should talk about. In the Shiji, on the other hand, there are many, many passages where it says Confucius didn't talk about this because the right people don't need to have it talked about, and the wrong people wouldn't understand. So it's sort of this esoteric, this sense that Confucius has the secret transmissions, and sometimes he will occasionally transmit it to a few people, like Zaiyu in this case, and yet he won't really talk about it very much because it wouldn't be understood by the vast majority of people. So the esoteric Confucius, and I have a couple of passages here. I just really don't have time to go through them. But that's fairly interesting. And so one of the things is that Sima Qian is really eager to talk about exactly those things which Confucius is too cautious in the Lunyu to discuss. So he really kind of talks about them a lot and brings in Confucius every time. And this kind of shades into also Sima Qian's use of Confucius in talking about the Book of Changes, the Classic of Changes. Sima Qian's Confucius is really a changes scholar, whereas in the Lunyu it's just mentioned one time and very offhandedly. All right. So kind of so that I'll have time for questions because I really want them, I'm just going to kind of conclude at this point. As I mentioned, Sima Qian's Confucius is basically primarily associated with the classics. It seems like the Lunyu was available to Sima Qian, or something like the Lunyu, but as a source, it was of somewhat secondary importance. Lunyu quotations are used kind of the way you'd expect. They're picked out, put into new contexts to lend authority, just like later it would be used later. But Sima Qian tends to use Lunyu sayings in other places in the Shiji to reflect Han concerns. How to judge and write history, what happened in the ancient past, how do we do powerful rituals, these kinds of things. But one thing he doesn't talk about is the virtue of filial piety in association with Confucius. And that's kind of interesting. So the development of Confucian texts and traditions in early China was really complicated. So in the Warring States, it's clear that Warring States Confucianism was very, very complicated, far more complicated than myths of a single core canonical Lunyu tradition can capture. It just wasn't that there was one text. It's becoming clear that there were a lot of texts floating around. In trying to get a sense of this development of the Confucian tradition, we're really fortunate to have the Shiji, which just barely precedes the Eastern Han dominance of the Lunyu Confucius. So Sima Qian had many of the same materials that these Eastern Han people had, but he didn't have the same attitudes towards those materials. And in trying to get a sense of Sima Qian's, trying to get a sense of Sima Qian's Lunyu and of his Confucius, it also can reveal just how complicated the whole picture must have been in early Western Han and before. Thanks.